At a popular diner in Waterbury, Connecticut, 52-year-old Gina Hale finished the last bites of her lasagna, being careful not to leave behind even a speck of the rich, delicious cheese. Across the table, her 55-year-old brother, Tony, downed his cheeseburger. This restaurant had been their hangout since they were kids, and whenever they came to this diner, where the old jukebox still had songs from the 1980s, it made them feel like they were teenagers again. From the moment they sat down on this July day in 2012, they were both wiping tears of laughter from their cheeks. Seeing Tony this happy made Gina smile. He'd been battling depression for a while now, and had finally gotten on the right antidepressants to help him feel like himself again. But as Gina watched Tony take a sip of his beer, she couldn't help but feel concerned. Now, with anybody else, a beer with lunch was no big deal, but Tony had abused alcohol for many years, and Gina couldn't hide her concern anymore. But Tony didn't even let Gina get a word out before he promised her this would be his last beer before he quit drinking cold turkey. Gina gave her brother a weak smile, trying hard not to remember all of his previous failed attempts at getting sober, which included 4 attempts at an actual rehab facility. She hoped this time it would stick, because all the drinking had really taken its toll on her brother. A little while later, when they got up to leave, Gina noticed that her brother was a bit slower than usual as he inched his way out of the booth. Out in the parking lot, Gina gave Tony a big hug as he hopped on his Harley and promised her he was okay to ride. He had the same brown eyes as their mother, and for a split second, it was like their mother's face flashed in front of Gina's eyes. Their mother had been an alcoholic too, and she eventually had died of cancer. And so as Gina watched her brother ride off down the street, she hoped he was not following in his mother's footsteps. Three weeks later, Gina broke a pane of glass at the back of her brother's house, then pried open the window and climbed inside. Gina hadn't heard from Tony in a few days. After their lunch they had together, he'd quit drinking cold turkey just as he'd promised. But it had not gone well. He'd been overcome by a condition called delirium tremens, which is when the body starts to shut down from alcohol withdrawal. Tony had been forced to spend an entire week in the hospital to recover, but he'd gotten through the worst of it, and Gina had hoped that this time he'd be able to stay sober. But now, it was clear something was wrong. Gina didn't know if Tony had gone into withdrawal again or maybe fallen off the wagon. But either way, he never just went radio silent like this. And now, looking around at the inside of his house, Gina knew it was bad. She crept through the rooms, calling her brother's name over and over, but there was no response. The unventilated house felt like an oven. As she wiped the sweat from her face, she looked at the dirty dishes and the overflowing garbage in the kitchen. She hadn't heard from Tony in days, and now, finding his home in this condition, she just couldn't stop the panic rising in her chest. Just then, a yellow streak flashed past her and she jumped. Her brother's tabby cat was suddenly at her feet, brushing up against her legs and yowling for attention. Gina could see that the cat's food dish was empty, and so she wondered why Tony hadn't fed his cat. As Gina was about to feed the cat just took off running down the hall and disappeared through the open door to the basement. Gina followed the cat down the hall, she turned to go down the stairs, she flipped on the basement light, and immediately she stopped. That's when she found her brother. Tony lay crumpled in a motionless heap down on the basement floor. Gina ran down the stairs to his side, and she could immediately tell he was badly hurt. His hair was matted with blood, his skin was a yellowish gray, and he had dark bruises all over his legs. Tony looked like he'd been lying there for a while, maybe even days. Gina pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. After she described what was going on, the dispatcher asked if Tony was breathing. Gina shakily replied that she couldn't tell. But just then, Tony's mouth opened and he began to cough. And as he gasped for air, his cracked, dry lips tried to form words. Gina begged the dispatcher to send help right away. After hanging up with the dispatcher, Gina took her brother's hand and leaned in close to hear what he was trying to say. But she couldn't make it out. He was just babbling something. And soon, his mysterious whispers were drowned out by the sounds of the ambulance pulling into the driveway. Three hours later, Gina sat down in the only seat left in the crowded ER waiting room, a tiny plastic chair in the kids' play area. As she sat there, she ate a bag of chips from the vending machine, wishing she had something more filling to eat. But mostly, she just couldn't stop thinking about the sight of her brother at the bottom of the basement stairs. his body twisted from the long fall. She really had thought Tony was dead, and she felt so grateful that he had a pulse when the EMTs finally reached him. Gina shifted uncomfortably in her chair for a few more minutes until the waiting room door swung open and a doctor finally called her name. Gina raced up to him, bracing for the worst. Tony was still alive, the doctor explained, but barely after his fall down the stairs. Tony had a severe concussion that may have damaged his brain, and he had suffered so much damage to his muscles in the fall that his kidneys had shut down. The doctor said he very likely would need dialysis, which is a process in which machines remove waste from the body when kidneys no longer function correctly. Even worse, Tony had suffered damage to his heart too, going into cardiac arrest in the ambulance. The paramedics had managed to restart his heart, but he was hanging on by a thread. Tony had gone comatose. To keep him alive, his doctors had put him on a ventilator to help him breathe and chilled his body temperature to 91.4 degrees to protect his brain. Gina asked if she could see her brother. The doctor nodded and said that Tony had been sent to the intensive care unit, but he warned her that Tony was in really bad shape, and so it wouldn't be easy to see him like that. Gina nodded and set off for the ICU. A few minutes later, the doctor's words were ringing in Gina's ears when the nurse on duty led her to her brother's door. But the sight of Tony still made Gina stifle a gasp. Her brother lay unconscious on the bed, covered in a pile of gel pads that were cooling his body. His swollen chest heaved up and down as the ventilator pumped oxygen down his throat and into his lungs, all while an IV line sent fluids and medicine into his body. Gina had never seen her big brother look so helpless. She walked up to him and touched his hand. It was cold and limp. Gina always knew Tony's alcohol abuse was going to hurt him if he didn't stop, but she never expected anything this bad. "5 weeks later, Gina stepped into Tony's hospital room carrying an almost empty donut box. Tony had spent 3 weeks in the ICU and then 2 more weeks in a regular hospital room. And as those 5 weeks had passed, Gina had gotten to know every staff member in the wing. And she'd brought them donuts because today was a special day. Tony was finally well enough to move out of the hospital and into a skilled nursing facility. Tony's room was quiet now that many of the monitors and tubes had been disconnected, but he was still bedbound. He needed dialysis 3 times a week while doctors kept trying to save his kidneys, and the ventilator that had been breathing for him was now replaced by a hole in his throat with a tube sticking out, so oxygen could go straight to his lungs. Tony couldn't speak at all because of this tube, but through it all, he was somehow managing to hold up okay emotionally. Gina was genuinely impressed by his determination to get better. Gina sat down next to Tony's bed, looked into his eyes, and took his hand. It was warm and pink, and with great effort, he managed to give her a corny, exaggerated thumbs up. She knew instantly her brother was joking with her. Tony often mocked other people who gave the thumbs up gesture. Gina laughed and gave it right back to him. That was the brother she remembered and loved. Two weeks later, a nurse's aide named Matilda Rogers pulled her cart down the hallway inside of the skilled nursing facility where Tony was staying. Matilda really enjoyed the early shift. In the hours before the building got busy with deliveries and family visits, she had a chance to really connect with most of her patients and give them a little inspiration for the day. She stopped the cart and locked the wheels outside of Tony's room. Tony was one of her favorites. Matilda loved his sense of humor, and she developed a morning ritual of greeting him with a joke or a riddle. During his 2 weeks at the nursing center, Tony had learned to speak again by using a special valve on the hole in his throat. His voice was still raspy and low, but Matilda loved it when she could make him laugh. She also encouraged him to imitate her silly dance moves, and that helped him slowly strengthen his arms and legs. And so he had been making steady progress. But when Matilda stepped into Tony's room, armed with a new joke she'd gotten from her 11-year-old niece, Tony sat stone-faced and silent in the corner. Matilda instantly knew he was not in the mood for jokes this morning. Tony didn't say a word as she crushed his meds into a fine powder and administered them through his feeding tube. When she was done, she washed her hands and asked permission to sit in his guest chair so they could talk. He nodded, so she took a seat and then tried her joke. But Tony didn't respond. She asked if there was something going on that maybe he wanted to share. And eventually, Tony's eyes began to well up, and he would tell her something very strange. He told her in his slow, raspy voice that people from his past had been visiting him in his room. Old friends and family, including folks he hadn't seen for many years, had been suddenly appearing by his bedside. They would stand there and sometimes even speak to Tony for about 10 seconds, but then they would just disappear. Matilda asked him if he'd been having trouble sleeping again. She told him she thought he might have had a disturbing dream, but Tony was adamant that he had not been asleep at all. He said he knew that the people he was seeing in his room were not real, but he definitely was seeing them. It was not a dream. Matilda could see how frightened Tony was and told him she was going to do everything she could to keep him safe. She walked back into the hallway to the medicine cart, then pulled up her notes from the weekly meeting with the staff psychiatrist. She saw that Tony had been prescribed a new sleep medication a few days ago. Her notes from the night nurse said Tony had tolerated it well, and there were no indications that Tony had been suffering bad dreams or hallucinations. She couldn't understand why cheerful Tony had suddenly turned so dark. Matilda finished delivering meds to the rest of the patients along Tony's hallway and returned to Tony's room half an hour later to see how he was doing. His mood had not changed. In fact, he was even more argumentative and agitated. He insisted that 2 of his former coworkers had come to his bedside while she was gone. Matilda said it was too early for visitors, but Tony didn't even seem to hear her. Suddenly, he pointed across the room, his eyes wide, and told Matilda he saw a little girl trying to pick up a needle off the floor behind her. Matilda turned to look, and of course, there was no girl and no needle. That's when Matilda noted that Tony's face was flushed and he was breathing rapidly. When she checked his heart rate and blood pressure, she saw those too were rising. This was moving from perhaps just a bad dream to a potential emergency. Matilda asked the change nurse to call 911. 15 minutes later, she helped escort a flailing, agitated Tony, now strapped to a gurney, into an ambulance for an emergency room evaluation. Dr. Mary Shaughnessy was on duty in the ER when paramedics wheeled in a thrashing, confused Tony. The 35-year-old doctor quickly reviewed the notes sent over by the skilled nursing facility, so she knew that Tony had a host of medical issues, from his damaged heart and kidneys to his recent severe concussion. But the first place she looked for a clue about Tony's erratic behavior was the extensive list of medications he was taking. Dr. Shaughnessy noticed that he'd been taking an antidepressant for a few years, so that was nothing new. Many alcoholics suffer from depression, which is part of the reason they drink to excess. But the psychiatrist at the nursing facility had added a sleeping medication called Ambien just 4 days earlier. Dr. Shaughnessy knew that Ambien can actually cause delirium in some people, even at seemingly normal doses. Maybe that's what was going on with Tony. Dr. Shaughnessy called a psychiatrist to review Tony's blood work, and they agreed that the Ambien could be responsible for Tony's hallucinations. So they took Ambien off of Tony's medication list and sent him back to the nursing facility with a prescription for a different kind of sleep medication. 2 days later, when nurse's aide, Matilda Rogers, parked her medicine cart in front of Tony's room, she was hopeful that Tony was back to his upbeat, positive self. So she walked into Tony's room wearing a big smile, but she found him flopping and rolling around on the floor, gasping and yelling through the speaking valve on his throat. He was clearly having some kind of a seizure, and so Matilda immediately pressed the emergency call button. Matilda managed to get Tony to stop thrashing and tried to calm him down. Through his garbled cries, she could make out that he was clearly terrified that someone was coming to get him. He claimed that smoke was coming through the walls, and his wide eyes scanned the room constantly, looking for some unseen menace. A moment later, 2 staffers raced into the room to help get Tony back onto his bed, followed by the doctor who was on duty. Clearly, something dangerous was going on in Tony's head, and they needed to find out what it was immediately. The doctor asked Matilda to call for an ambulance to take Tony right back to the emergency room. 3 hours later, Dr. Shaughnessy reviewed Tony's lab results on a monitor next to his bed inside of the ER. Tony's sister, Gina, paced back and forth beside her. Gina had made it clear to Dr. Shaughnessy that she was not leaving until someone could explain to her what was going on with her brother. Dr. Shaughnessy wished she knew. Seeing Tony being wheeled back in from the nursing center 48 hours after she had discharged him was discouraging. It meant that her first guess must have been wrong. maybe the Ambien sleeping pills were not causing Tony's problems after all. And there was no denying that Tony's condition had deteriorated. He couldn't tell Dr. Shaughnessy what day it was, or where he had just come from. And not only was he more agitated, he now had a low-grade fever, and his heart was racing. In addition, his legs were swollen and they shook involuntarily when she manipulated his feet. All these signs suggested that Tony might have suffered some injury to his nervous system. Dr. Shaughnessy worried she might have missed something crucial the last time she saw Tony. She had ordered yet another round of scans and x-rays, plus the usual blood work and urinalysis. And all of the tests came back just like the last time, normal. All except the urinalysis. Dr. Shaughnessy explained to Gina that her brother's urine showed that he had contracted a serious urinary tract infection. This sort of infection is common among people who are bedridden, the doctor said, and it could explain Tony's delusions and paranoia. She said that severe UTIs can cause psychological symptoms as the body fights off the bacteria. But she said the good news was that urinary tract infections are completely treatable. Relief washed over Gina's face as Dr. Shaughnessy told her that she was going to admit Tony to the hospital. She was sure that a strong course of antibiotics would get him back on track. Two days later, an attending physician named Lucinda Bragg made her way to Tony's hospital room as she did rounds with her staff. As a senior physician, part of Dr. Bragg's job was to do rounds with the hospital interns and examine particularly challenging cases. And Tony's certainly fit the bill. So far, nobody had been able to figure out what was causing his hallucinations. Dr. Bragg hoped that this collective group might be able to come up with a new idea. As Dr. Bragg introduced herself and the group to Tony, she could see that he remained frightened and trembling, and the monitor showed that his blood pressure and heart rate remained elevated. Dr. Bragg explained to the staff that Tony was being treated for a urinary tract infection that doctors believed was causing the hallucinations. But after 2 days of treatment with strong antibiotics, Dr. Bragg said that Tony's UTI was getting better, but his mental state was not. Just then, Gina entered Tony's room. Dr. Bragg could immediately see the anxiety on Gina's face with all these people in the room, and so Dr. Bragg asked the other doctors to leave for a moment. After reassuring Gina that she was determined to help, Dr. Bragg took another look at Tony's medical history. Everything looked completely normal. There wasn't anything that stood out to her. But then, something occurred to Dr. Bragg. There was a very rare condition that she'd heard about, but had never actually personally treated. It was a condition that most doctors had never heard of, and was caused by something that few people would think could be harmful, let alone potentially fatal. From what Dr. Bragg remembered about it, this condition could cause hallucinations and confusion, affect heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature, and have a severe impact on muscle function. Basically, it explained all of Tony's symptoms, and if it was left untreated, it could be devastating. But before Dr. Bragg said anything about this to Gina, she wanted to get a second opinion. So Dr. Bragg excused herself to the hallway and tracked down a neurologist colleague. When Dr. Bragg told the neurologist about her suspicions, the neurologist could hardly believe it. But he double-checked Tony's charts, and from what he could tell, Dr. Bragg had finally found the answer. Tony and his doctors didn't know it, but he had been unknowingly overdosing on a potent chemical that plays a huge role in controlling our moods and feelings. It's called serotonin, and its primary job is to carry messages between nerves in the brain and throughout the body. But serotonin is best known for the way it improves mood. A whole industry has grown up around pills that stimulate the body's production of what many people call the feel-good chemical. And Tony's blood was flooded with it, to the point where it was causing his brain to go haywire and his body to shut down. This condition is called serotonin syndrome, and Tony was experiencing it because of a mix-up in his medications. When Tony was admitted to the skilled nursing facility, he was accidentally prescribed a second antidepressant. Antidepressants work by increasing the serotonin levels in the brain. But even a double dose of these antidepressants was not enough to trigger the adverse effects of serotonin syndrome. However, Tony was also prescribed yet another medication that can increase serotonin levels. This one was a treatment for his heartburn. And so it was this third medication on top of the double dose of antidepressants that combined to cause his serotonin syndrome. And so after the neurologist confirmed Dr. Bragg's diagnosis, Tony was taken off of those 2 antidepressants, and right away he made an incredible recovery. In May of 2009, 48-year-old Rodrigo Rosenberg was at the peak of his career as one of Guatemala's most prominent lawyers. Tall, handsome, and charismatic, Rodrigo had law degrees from both Cambridge University and Harvard University, and he was the co-founder of a very successful corporate law office in Guatemala City, the country's capital. And while it was obvious that Rodrigo had worked very hard for all of the nice things he had, like his luxury Mercedes-Benz car, in reality, he didn't really have to work for a living. Rodrigo had been born into privilege. There was wealth on both sides of his family. His mother had brought a large inheritance to her marriage, and his father had built a massive business empire that included a chain of movie cinemas. When Rodrigo stepped out of his office building in downtown Guatemala City to meet a client for lunch at one of the upscale restaurants tucked away in the capital's maze of boutiques and little markets, he looked exactly like what he was, a member, like his parents before him, of the Guatemalan oligarchy, a small group of rich, upper-class conservative Guatemalans who had connections and influence in government and business. He always wore a dark, perfectly tailored suit, an immaculate white shirt, and a pale blue tie, an expensive uniform that set off his dark features and the ring of black hair cut short around the crown of his bald head. And when Rodrigo talked to his client in one of those hacienda-style eateries with red clay-tiled roofs and cool stucco interiors that he especially favored, it wouldn't be long before his client, like all of Rodrigo's clients, realized that it wasn't just the money or influence that drove Rodrigo. Like his friends and associates like to say, Rodrigo had a strong sense of purpose as well as ambition, and a very strong sense of right and wrong. He had chosen a career in law because he liked the clarity of the law. If it was practiced fairly, he felt like it was the best way of settling disagreements and disputes. But the thing that really made Rodrigo stand out in this Central American country of 16 million people was not just his brilliance and his drive, it was the fact that he had a reputation for absolute honesty. Because Guatemala was a country best known in the world for its incredible levels of corruption and violence. Even though 36 years of civil war between authoritarian rulers and leftist guerrillas had ended back in 1994, that conflict had left more than 200,000 people, many of them civilians, dead, and another 45,000 people, quote, disappeared, which meant either killed or kidnapped, mostly the work of government forces or right-wing paramilitary groups. But after the 1994 peace agreement was signed, most of the people in Guatemala who had committed the murders and rapes and other widespread human rights violations that took place during the Civil War were never prosecuted or called to account for their crimes. Instead, in the post-Civil War Guatemala, these should-be war criminals simply turned to new careers, such as participating in organized crime, becoming assassins for hire, or getting in on the very lucrative Central and South American drug trade. And 15 years later, even though Guatemala had a democratically elected civilian president who had promised to root out crime and government corruption, these criminals and their criminal networks had still been able to reach their tentacles into almost every government and law enforcement agency, and nearly half the country wasn't under any government control at all. By 2009, Guatemala had the third highest murder rate of any country in the world, averaging more than 123 homicides every week, and 97% of those murders went unsolved. And the few cases that did go to trial often ended with the alleged killers going free after judges or prosecutors or witnesses were bribed, threatened, or even murdered. So in this sea of corruption, where everyone with power seemed to have dirt on their hands, Rodrigo stood out for his willingness to shamelessly call out criminal behavior wherever he saw it. So to anyone who knew Rodrigo, it didn't come as any surprise when he wasn't just horrified when one of his very own clients was assassinated in broad daylight. He was absolutely furious, especially since this particular client, Musa Khalil, had a reputation for being a very ethical businessman who treated his workers fairly. Since arriving in Guatemala from Lebanon when he was just a young man, 76-year-old Musa had worked his way up from poverty to become a successful coffee producer and textile manufacturer. Although Rodrigo was not personally close to Musa, Rodrigo admired and respected the older man because the man refused to steal from the state or make payoffs to get favorable deals on his coffee or manufacturing companies. Musa was a straight shooter, just like Rodrigo. The assassination took place in Guatemala City on April 14, 2009, as Musa and his 37-year-old daughter Marjorie were waiting in their car at a traffic light while on their way to lunch. According to eyewitnesses, a car pulled up quickly behind them and a man hopped out and approached the front passenger seat of the Khalil's car where Musa was sitting. Musa and his daughter likely assumed that this man just wanted to ask them a question, but as soon as this man reached their car window, he pulled out a 9mm pistol and he fired 9 shots into Musa's head and torso. By the time the police arrived, the gunman had fled the scene on the back of a motorcycle driven by an accomplice, and Musa, along with his daughter, were both dead. It would turn out one of those 9 bullets that were fired at Musa had passed right through his body and struck and killed his daughter. She was not the intended target, she was just collateral damage. On the day of the murders, right after Rodrigo had found out about them, he contacted his 24-year-old son, Eduardo, who was also a lawyer at Rodrigo's law firm, and told him to meet him at the crime scene. When Eduardo arrived, he found his father pacing back and forth in front of the yellow crime scene tape, demanding answers from the police who had converged on the scene along with medical personnel. Turning to his approaching son, Rodrigo swept his arms out to either side in a gesture of helplessness and frustration that took in the whole chaotic scene in front of them. There was also an expression of shock and sadness on his father's face that Eduardo didn't see very often. You couldn't live in Guatemala without feeling like violence, even murder, was just business as usual. But Eduardo also understood that there was something different about this crime, something that made it stand out, especially to members of the city's wealthy upper class. Because, like them, Musa and his whole family were people with power and influence. They had personal ties with people inside the administration of Guatemala's president, Alvaro Colom. If Musa could be gunned down in cold blood in the middle of the day, others among the Guatemalan elite worried that the same thing could happen to them too. Before leaving the crime scene, Rodrigo told his son in a bitter voice that the police, like always, would probably never find and prosecute the people who killed Musa and Marjorie. And even if they did, they'd never be able to touch whoever it was that had organized the assassination in the first place. It didn't take long for Rodrigo's prediction to come true. Even though thousands of people turned out for the funeral service of Musa and his daughter, including President Colom's powerful private secretary, police made absolutely no progress on tracking down the killers, and it wasn't long before the murders just seemed like all the others in Guatemala, just numbers on a stat sheet. Except this time, Rodrigo had had enough. Musa had been a good man, and his innocent daughter, Marjorie, had left behind a husband and 2 children. And so if the police were not going to catch their killers, then Rodrigo would. Rodrigo told his son that one way or another, he was going to get to the bottom of this and figure out exactly who did it and why. But almost as soon as he got started asking questions, Rodrigo noticed that even by Guatemalan standards, the police seemed to have gathered virtually no information outside of taking the obligatory statements from witnesses who saw the assassination and asking Musa's family if he had had any business or money troubles. And as Rodrigo began calling some of his contacts within the government about the police investigation, he began to wonder whether there was an active attempt going on inside President Colom's circle of advisors to cover up some connection that the government itself might have to the assassination. So just a few days after Musa's funeral, Rodrigo turned to another one of his clients, a man named Luis Mendizabal, who was also a close friend of Rodrigo's. After calling Luis to arrange a visit, Rodrigo slipped out of his law office and drove to the exclusive men's clothing store that Luis owned in one of the capital's most fashionable districts. But the fitting and sale of handmade suits was just part of the business that Luis operated out of that storefront. To those who knew him well, they knew that Luis's real skill was in the collection of secrets and information. With his flowing white hair and trim mustache and his easy banter about his family and his grandchildren, Luis did not look the part of a spy. But as he measured and cut fabric and chatted with a wealthy clientele that included criminals, businessmen, military, police, and government bureaucrats, Luis gathered huge amounts of insider intel on what was going on in their country. And so if there was anyone who could help Rodrigo find out who killed Musa and Marjorie, it was Luis. Rodrigo's hunch paid off. Before long, Luis had come up with a possible lead in the Musa murder case. A few months before the assassination, at the very beginning of 2009, Musa had been nominated to serve on the board of directors for two institutions that both had ties to something called the Rural Development Bank, or the Ban Rural. The Ban Rural was the major funding source for the president's popular social programs, and these two institutions that had invited Musa to join them were engaged in a power struggle over which one of them would control the bank. But since rumors of sketchy financial dealings were already swirling around Ban Rural, when Musa was offered these two board positions, Rodrigo had actually advised him not to accept either of them. However, Rodrigo had no idea what Musa's final decision had been. Luis suspected that Musa, as he began to do his own research on these two institutions, had uncovered that one or both of them were engaged in financial mismanagement. More conversations with Musa's family seemed to confirm this theory. One of Musa's surviving daughters told Rodrigo that her father had received threatening letters from officials on the two boards, and that Musa had apparently written back to them saying, "You can't tell me what to do, and I will protect myself from my enemies." During the 3 weeks that followed Musa's assassination, Eduardo saw less and less of his father, who was spending more and more of his time on his own private investigation into these murders. It seemed to everyone who knew Rodrigo that his outrage over the murders had turned into an unhealthy obsession. Rodrigo basically stopped going in to the law office or returning calls to his regular clients, and instead just stayed home in his apartment where he lived alone to pore over his notes on the murders. And when Eduardo did meet his father for lunch or for dinner, Rodrigo barely touched his food, and all he wanted to talk about was his theory that Musa had somehow become the target of a conspiracy at the highest levels of government. His father, who had been an avid cyclist, had completely stopped going on his morning bike rides. He'd lost weight, his perfectly tailored suits hung on him just loosely enough that he looked disheveled, and his eyes never stopped moving, constantly checking his phone for calls and messages, and showing no interest at all about how things were going back at the office. Eduardo knew that both his parents were still struggling after having separated the year before. Rodrigo's own father had abandoned his family when Rodrigo was very young, and Rodrigo had never forgiven him, even refusing to accept the inheritance his father had left for him. So after Rodrigo's separation, when his estranged wife moved to neighboring Mexico with their 4 children, Rodrigo was crushed. He felt like he had abandoned his own family. Looking at his father now, Eduardo worried that any progress his father might have made in adjusting to his new situation and moving on with his personal life was now being completely consumed by this private murder investigation. It was obvious to Eduardo that this investigation had become more than just finding the killers. It was about trying to actually stop corruption at the heart of Guatemala's politics. And in early May of that year, Rodrigo suddenly knew, without a doubt, that all that digging and all the documents he was putting together about corruption at Ban Rural, all the names and dates of meetings, the involvement of President Colom and his wife, all of it was finally getting him closer to the people who had murdered his client. For weeks, he'd had the feeling that he was being followed, that everywhere he went outside of his apartment, someone was watching him. But now he had proof. Because now Rodrigo, like Musa, had started receiving threats. Except his threats were phone calls, not letters. The first call came on May 5th. It only lasted long enough for the caller to tell Rodrigo to stop his investigation into the murders. After that, the calls came once a day with the same message. And even though Rodrigo couldn't recognize the deliberately distorted voice on the other end of the line, he started to suspect that the threats were coming directly from within President Colom's inner circle, from Colom's private secretary himself, a man named Gustavo Alejos, who actually had an office directly across from the apartment where Rodrigo lived. Not only was Gustavo an influential advisor to the president, his brother was the head of the Guatemalan Congress. After these threatening calls started coming in, Rodrigo, who was far more excited at this development than afraid, called his spy friend Luis to tell him about how he thought Gustavo Alejos was the caller. Rodrigo also asked Luis to write down the unknown telephone number that belonged to this threatening caller. Even though he didn't say it explicitly, it was clear to Luis that he was being told to take this number down in case something happened to Rodrigo. After the two friends hung up, Luis felt very concerned. He felt like Rodrigo was aware of the danger he was in, but wasn't fully appreciating it. And so on May 8th, after Rodrigo met Luis at his clothing shop, Luis quickly pulled his friend into a back room, and once the door was shut and they were alone, Luis told Rodrigo in a hushed tone that not only should he stop his investigation into the murders, but that he should flee Guatemala altogether. Clearly, his life was in danger given the threatening phone calls he was getting, but Rodrigo said he could not stop now. He knew he was close to getting the name of Musa's killer and solid proof that the government had been involved in the assassination. He also told Luis, as a way of reassuring him, that once he had all the evidence he needed, he was not about to go to the Guatemalan police, who very well could have even played a role in the murders. Instead, he planned to present his findings to the powerful and high-profile International Criminal Court that is seated in The Hague in the Netherlands. The ICC is known around the world for trying cases that involve genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and aggression, and for trying criminals like the ones in Guatemala who all received immunity from the Guatemalan government at the end of the Guatemalan Civil War. By going directly to The Hague, Rodrigo would finally be taking action against a system of government corruption that had, in the words of one of his friends, been eating at his guts for years. However, before he could go any further with this case, Rodrigo told Luis, as they sat in the back of Luis's shop, that there was one very specific thing that Rodrigo still had to do, and in order to do it, he needed Luis's help. It was a favor, and it was an insurance policy that no matter what happened in any court of law, the information that Rodrigo had uncovered was guaranteed to become public knowledge. Reluctantly, Luis agreed, and after discussing the details, they arranged to meet again the next day. As Rodrigo left the store, Luis had a bad feeling. He was certain that whatever the outcome of Rodrigo's plan, it was sure to bring a lot of pain to his family and to his friends. 2 days later, on Sunday, May 10th, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Rodrigo stepped into one of the bedrooms of his trendy luxury apartment in the Zona 1 neighborhood of Guatemala City. Glancing out the window, he could see the faint outlines of the mountains that ringed the capital. But his mind was on other things. Luis had been as good as his word and had helped Rodrigo put together the final pieces of the case that he had been building one fact at a time against the Guatemalan government. His bodyguard, who also served as his driver, had also been willing to help, running a couple of errands the week before that Rodrigo had not been able to see to himself, including taking Rodrigo's bike in for a tune-up. It had been more than a month since Rodrigo had done any serious cycling, but the night before, he'd made up his mind that this morning he was going to go out and go for a ride, even if it was just a short one. He was lucky with the day's weather. May was one of Guatemala's rainiest months, but that morning was dry and the sun was breaking through the clouds. Rodrigo pulled on his navy blue bike shorts and blue short-sleeved top and laced up his white sneakers. Leaving his bedroom, he checked the gold watch on his left wrist and then walked toward the front door, pausing long enough to grab the red and white mountain bike that was leaning against the wall in the front hallway. He wheeled his bike to the elevator, and a minute later, he was pushing the bike out of the apartment complex onto the sidewalk that led to the main street that ran left to right in front of the building. Once Rodrigo made it to the edge of this main road, he looked both ways along the road to see if any cars were coming, and as he did that, the sun broke through and suddenly lit up the grass and trees along either side of the street. Just before getting on his bike, Rodrigo checked to make sure his iPod was queued up to his favorite band, Santana. He hit play, and then he pushed his bike off the curb into the road, he turned right, then hopped on his bike, and began pedaling down the street. After only a few hundred yards, Rodrigo turned right again off of the main road onto a service road. The sun reflected off the windows of a brown and white high-rise apartment just ahead of him on the left. Minutes later, Rodrigo noticed a man running across the street in front of him from the left to the right, and at first, Rodrigo thought it was a jogger. But then he noticed this man was wearing jeans and a dark jacket with a high collar. The running man, after he crossed the street and was on the right side, he slowed and then looked intently at Rodrigo, and for a second, their eyes met. And then this man with the jeans and the jacket began running at full speed towards Rodrigo. Okay, back to the story. Before Rodrigo could do anything except make a final erratic swerve to the right that took his bike right to the edge of the curb, the man had closed the distance between them, reached into the waistband of his jeans, and pulled out a gun. Rodrigo felt the thud of the first 3 bullets and heard the loud crack of each shot. His bike clattered to the pavement as he fell backward over the curb until he was half laying in the grassy median. By the time the second 2 bullets shattered Rodrigo's jaw and forehead, Rodrigo was dead. A few seconds later, nearby residents heard the sound of a car gunning its engine and roaring off into the distance. Within minutes, those same residents of the Zona 1 neighborhood were on their phones, making frantic calls to 911 to report the sound of gunfire. Police were on the scene almost immediately. On his way to Rodrigo's apartment, Rodrigo's bodyguard heard the sirens and saw the police cars that were blocking the service road near his employer's apartment. He slowed down, and as police started setting up a perimeter, he thought he caught a glimpse of a red and white bike on the pavement. He parked his car at the top of the service road, and as he jumped out and headed towards the knot of police and emergency personnel, he pulled out his phone and called Rodrigo's son, Eduardo, because by now, the bodyguard could clearly see that the body sprawled on the edge of the service road near that red and white bike belonged to his employer. Rodrigo's bodyguard had known what Rodrigo was working on. He'd even run some errands that he'd suspected were related to the case his boss was investigating. He'd warned Rodrigo to be careful. He wished now that he had insisted on staying over last night and accompanying Rodrigo on this bike ride. A few minutes later, Eduardo, as well as his father's friend, Luis, showed up at the crime scene. Ashen-faced, Eduardo identified himself as Rodrigo's son, but before he and Luis had time to process what they were seeing, they were both approached by Guatemala police officers who were eager to start gathering information about what had happened. Right as the 2 men stepped back away from the carnage in front of them, Eduardo noticed his father was wearing a wedding ring on his finger again. And instantly when he saw that, Eduardo recalled a secret his father had told him right around the time Musa and Marjorie had been killed. And as he thought of this secret, Eduardo felt an unexpected rush of grief come over him, and his eyes started to fill with tears. He felt so sorry for his father, and he just hoped that the police would be able to find his killer and bring them to justice. But before the police could really even begin their investigation, something happened that would push the Guatemalan government to the edge of total collapse. On May 12th, 2 days after Rodrigo's murder, hundreds of people crowded into a church to attend Rodrigo's funeral service. The pews were filled wall to wall with his family, friends, clients, government officials, business leaders, and the fashionably dressed members of the capital's wealthy oligarchy. Right after Eduardo had delivered his father's eulogy, Rodrigo's friend, Luis, stepped forward and addressed the mourners, who looked like a who's who of the Guatemalan elite. Taking a deep breath, Luis said to the crowd that he knew they were all asking themselves the same question. Why would anyone want to kill Rodrigo Rosenberg? Then Luis held up his hand, showing the crowd a case that contained a DVD. This, he said, contained the answer to that question. Once the surprised and excited murmurs quieted down, Luis went on to say that Rodrigo had left instructions that if he was murdered, then Luis should go public with the 18-minute-long video that he now held in his hand. Luis, who said that he himself had only seen the video after his friend's death, invited anyone in the crowd interested to take a copy of the DVD with them when they left. One of the mourners who took Luis up on that offer was a government minister who immediately called President Colom's personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos, to tell him what had just happened. A few minutes later, the minister slipped out of the church and drove straight to the National Palace in the center of Guatemala City, where President Colomb lived with his wife. As President Colomb, along with his vice president and closest advisors, gathered in the president's office, an aide slipped the disc into the president's computer and then hit play. A second later, they were all staring at an image of Rodrigo sitting alone behind a table with a blue screen behind him. He was wearing his usual navy blue suit, pressed white shirt, light blue tie, and wedding ring. In front of him was a microphone. There was nothing professional or polished about the production of the video that filled the computer screen in front of the president and his aides. And for some reason, that made the message that Rodrigo delivered even more believable and chilling. After stating his name for the record, Rodrigo wasted no time dropping the bombshell that would soon be heard all over the world, as the 18-minute-long video was uploaded to YouTube, where it would go viral under the simple title, YouTube Murder. On the video, Rodrigo very calmly states, "If you are seeing or hearing this message, it means that I've been murdered by President Alvaro Colomb with the help of his personal secretary, Gustavo Alejos." Rodrigo would also blame the president, his wife, and Gustavo Alejos for the assassination of Musa Khalil and his daughter. Rodrigo stated that they were killed because Musa's involvement with the Rural Development Bank, Ban Rural, had put him in a position to reveal the president and first lady's abuse and misappropriation of Ban Rural funds. Rodrigo said the president's motive for killing him, Rodrigo, was because Rodrigo had direct knowledge of the conspiracy to kill Musa, and that Rodrigo also had proof that the president and first lady were using Ban Rural to embezzle and launder millions of dollars. Rodrigo warned Guatemalans against believing the smear campaign and cover-ups that would greet these accusations, ending with a plea to all Guatemalans that it was time for massive government reform. And the first step was to get rid of President Colomb and replace him with the vice president, who was not a thief or assassin, and whose duty it would be to bring the rule of law back to Guatemala. Rodrigo's video would have a massive ripple effect. Within hours of its upload to YouTube, Guatemala was plunged into a sudden and totally unexpected political crisis. The people of Guatemala, for the most part, believed what Rodrigo was saying. Even some of the president's own advisors wondered if the accusations were true. The president's initial reaction was not to respond to the accusations himself, but rather to send two of his aides out to publicly dismiss the video as a fake. However, this would have the opposite effect. And so that night, under lots of mounting pressure, President Colomb went on national TV to deny the accusations himself. However, he looked more scared and nervous than convincing. Meanwhile, so many people from all over the world were watching this video that YouTube servers started to crash, and protesters wearing white shirts to symbolize their demand for a clean government started to flood the streets of Guatemala's capital city. Alvaro Colomb knew before the end of that Tuesday, May 12th, that his presidency was hanging on by just a thread. So when protesters and the Guatemalan elite demanded that a United Nations-backed agency, rather than the Guatemalan police, handle the investigation into Rodrigo's death, the president knew he had to agree. By the next morning, May 13th, the whole investigation was in the hands of an international commission called the CICIG. This organization had been created by the United Nations in 2007 to investigate specific cases of systemic violence and corruption. And under the direction of Spanish Judge Carlos Castrosana, who took up residence in Guatemala City, an international group of investigators did what Guatemalan police either couldn't do or wouldn't do. They began relentlessly drilling down into who was behind the assassination of Rodrigo Rosenberg. The first break in the case happened almost immediately. Whoever had organized the hit on Rodrigo had chosen one of the most heavily videotaped neighborhoods in Guatemala. While investigators couldn't find a reliable eyewitness to the crime, footage gathered from dozens of security cameras near Rodrigo's apartment had captured almost the entire assassination on camera. Almost immediately after getting onto his bicycle at 8:05 a.m., Rodrigo was followed by a black late-model Mazda. Security cameras also caught clear enough images of that black getaway car that investigators were eventually able to track down the car and then its owner. and when they examined the car owner's phone records and location data, investigators were able to place him and several calls he made on the day of the murder at or near the crime scene. Investigators immediately set up a wiretap operation on the car owner, and for the next 4 months, they listened in on his conversations, and quickly, they discovered that he was part of a criminal gang made up of 10 men, most of them former national police officers. Meanwhile, using the CIG powers, Judge Castrosana started identifying and arresting corrupt members of the Guatemalan government, and as Rodrigo had predicted in his 18-minute video, investigators were up against a disinformation campaign organized by the president or his top advisors aimed at interfering with the investigation and smearing the vice president, the man Rodrigo had tapped as Colom's successor. But it wasn't until September, 4 months after Rodrigo was killed, that Judge Castrosana got the breakthrough he was looking for. After a massive raid on 10 different locations throughout Guatemala, investigators arrested all 10 members of the criminal gang whose phones investigators had been tapping. Once in custody, it didn't take long for members of this gang to start giving up information in exchange for lighter sentences. And so quickly, investigators were able to start to piece together how the murder was carried out, except they were missing a crucial piece of information. The 10-person gang clearly didn't know Rodrigo. They were just following orders to have him killed. But what the investigators couldn't figure out was who gave them that order. Who was the person behind the scenes making this assassination happen? Judge Castrosana and his team believed this person was an inside man, someone who had been close enough to Rodrigo, who had not ridden his bike in over a month, to know that Rodrigo had chosen that morning to go for a bike ride down that service road. But it wouldn't be until investigators tracked down a small piece of paper with a faded signature on it that the so-called inside man would be revealed. Based on all the information investigators found, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to Rodrigo Rosenberg. On Friday, May 1st, 16 days after the murder of Musa and his daughter Marjorie, and 9 days before Rodrigo's murder, the inside man, who would mastermind Rodrigo's assassination, contacted one of his most trusted lieutenants. He told him to go buy 2 prepaid mobile phones, he told the man to pay cash, and warned him not to sign his name on any paperwork or sales receipt. The lieutenant did as he was told and dropped both phones along with the sales receipt off at the office of the inside man. By this point, the inside man had already arranged the hit on Rodrigo. He had reached out to 2 men who were actually close friends and relatives of Rodrigo, 2 powerful brothers who owned one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in Guatemala. The inside man had told them that he needed their help arranging a hit on a man he described as a, quote, extortionist. The brothers said they knew of a criminal gang that would probably do the hit for about $40,000. The 3 men settled the details. The brothers told the inside man that they would contact the hitmen and arrange the payment, along with the delivery of a burner phone that the hitmen would use to communicate with the inside man. The inside man set the murder date for Sunday, May 10th, and told the hitman that he would be in touch with them before that day with a detailed physical description of their target, along with information on where and when they should actually commit the murder. Then, starting on Monday, May 4th, the inside man used the second prepaid cell phone to start calling Rodrigo's personal cell phone. He called Rodrigo at least once a day for the next 5 days, speaking only long enough to make a single threat, telling the lawyer to stop investigating the assassination of Musa Khalil. On May 9th, 1 day before Rodrigo's murder, the inside man called the hitmen to tell them that Rodrigo would be on a bike and would be most vulnerable shortly after leaving his apartment when he turned onto a nearby service road. The next day, shortly before 8 a.m., the 2 hitmen sitting outside Rodrigo's apartment in the black Mazda with tinted windows heard their phone buzz. The driver took the call and turned on the speakerphone, and then they heard the sound of the inside man's voice. The shooter sat up and listened while he double-checked that his 9mm pistol was loaded. The voice on the phone was low and calm. Their target, he told them, was a tall, thin man dressed in navy shorts, a light blue top, and white sneakers. He would be leaving the apartment building at about 8:05 a.m. He'd be riding a red and white mountain bike. He told them to follow Rodrigo onto that service road and then ambush him there. He told them to approach Rodrigo from behind and shoot him in the back, and then once he was down, fire at least 4 more shots into Rodrigo's neck, up into his jaw, and a final shot into his forehead. The inside man told the hitmen to be sure they destroyed the cell phone he had given them, along with its SIM card, once the assassination was complete. The hitmen said they understood, and they hung up. At the same time, Rodrigo was standing in one of his bedrooms in his apartment looking out the window, and then a couple of seconds later, he turned around and went into the kitchen where he made sure his coffee maker was turned off. Then he collected his bike from the hallway. Pushing his bike next to him, he headed to the apartment elevator and punched the button for the ground floor where he exited the building. Once outside, Rodrigo made his way towards the main street, taking a few seconds to enjoy the cool temperatures and the sudden sunshine that was pouring through a break in the clouds. Then he queued up a song by Santana on his iPod, and despite feeling a little rusty and stiff, he hopped onto his bike, he turned right, and he began heading down the main street. After a few hundred yards, he turned onto the service road. When he saw the man in jeans and the dark jacket running towards him, he tensed up, but only for a second. Then he quickly turned his bike towards the side of the road where he jammed on his brakes, coming to a complete and sudden stop. Then he got off of his bike, dropping it onto the pavement in front of him, and then he sat down on the curb with his back to the man running toward him. A moment later, Rodrigo would have felt the first bullet hit him in the back. Before he could even absorb the punch or feel any pain, he felt the next 4 bullets hit. 1 in his cheek, 1 in his neck, 1 just below his jaw, and finally, with the killer standing right in front of him, another round into his forehead, knocking his upper body backward onto the grassy median. Seconds later, residents of the apartments in Zona 1 called the police. It would turn out the inside man, the person responsible for Rodrigo's assassination, was Rodrigo himself. He had been devastated by the assassination not only of his client Musa, but of Musa's daughter Marjorie. As Rodrigo had secretly told his son Eduardo and his friend Luis, Rodrigo was deeply in love with Marjorie, and they were planning to get married as soon as Marjorie divorced her husband. The wedding ring that Rodrigo had been wearing at the time of his death, and when he was seen on camera in the YouTube murder video, had been a gift from Marjorie just before she was killed. The raw grief Rodrigo felt over the senseless killing of the woman he loved, along with his absolute conviction that the hit on Musa had been planned by a corrupt president, his wife, and personal secretary, had combined to create a feeling of total hopelessness in Rodrigo's head. At some point early in Rodrigo's investigation into Musa's assassination, Rodrigo realized that even if he could prove his allegations of corruption against the government, there was no way that anyone that high up in government would ever be charged or punished for their crimes. So early in May, Rodrigo, crushed by despair, came up with a plan that would both end his own personal misery and, he hoped, would set Guatemala on the road to real reform. It would be a suicide dressed up to look like an assassination, and with the video he planned to make before his death, Rodrigo hoped that his staged assassination would result in a bloodless coup that would take down the presidency of Alvaro Colom. So it was Rodrigo who had contacted his wife's cousins, the owners of the giant pharmaceutical company, and told them that he wanted to arrange a hit on an extortionist, a man, he told them, who had been after Rodrigo for money. His cousins had agreed, never once suspecting that the extortionist was actually Rodrigo himself. And the trusted lieutenant that Rodrigo had asked to go buy the 2 prepaid cell phones, that was Rodrigo's trusted bodyguard/driver. Rodrigo had made sure one of those 2 prepaid phones was delivered to the hitmen, and he used the other phone to make threatening calls to his own personal cell phone, and to give his killers his own personal description and to tell them exactly when and where they could find and kill him. And so on the morning of his own death, when Rodrigo saw the man in jeans and a jacket running toward him, he knew it was his killer. So he just pulled over, sat on the curb, and waited to be killed. As for the 18-minute-long YouTube murder video, the insurance policy that guaranteed Rodrigo's allegations of corruption could not be swept under the rug, that was produced by Guatemala's top spy and Rodrigo's friend, Luis, with the help of one of Luis's contacts in Guatemala's right-wing press. Although he eventually admitted his hand in making the video, Luis claimed he had no idea that Rodrigo was planning his own assassination. It is possible that Rodrigo's identity as the inside man might have gone undiscovered, except for the security footage that led investigators to the owner of that black Mazda, and the fact that Rodrigo's bodyguard made a critical mistake that linked the prepaid cell phones to his boss. When the bodyguard purchased those two burner phones, he did what Rodrigo said not to. He signed his name on one of the sales tax slips and submitted that slip of paper with his faded signature on it to a secretary at Rodrigo's law office. Even though Rodrigo's videotaped allegations of widespread government corruption were true and resulted in the CICIG removing hundreds of corrupt government officials from their jobs, it would turn out Musa Khalil's assassination and the unintended murder of his daughter Marjorie were not the work of Guatemalan government officials. Just as Guatemala's one honest lawyer was prepared to stage an assassination that could send his own cousins to prison, apparently the honest and incorruptible Musa was buying contraband from criminal networks for use in his textile factory. When Musa refused to pay those suppliers, they had him killed. Once Judge Castrosana released his findings and named Rodrigo as his own killer, the CICIG and government brought charges against Rodrigo's cousins, as well as the 10 members of the criminal gang that helped facilitate the hit. As for President Colom, the YouTube murder video scandal would end up actually strengthening his presidency. His decision to turn over the investigation into Rodrigo's death to a third party, the CICIG, and wait for their report, gave him the public appearance of being a calm and confident leader. Daniel Dukes always seemed to have an issue with respecting boundaries. In 1996, when Daniel was 24 years old, he became obsessed with this video game series called Ultima, which in the early days of PC gaming was this huge hit. It was this open world role-playing fantasy game. Daniel figured out where the creator of this game lived, and in the middle of the night in the spring of that year, he went to this guy's house and he knocked on the door. And when the creator did not answer the door, Daniel's frustrated and he leaves, but comes back a couple hours later and proceeds to break a window, climb inside this guy's house. He goes upstairs and he goes into one of the bedrooms where he crawls into one of the beds and falls asleep. The next morning, when the creator got up, he finds Daniel laying in one of his beds and he starts yelling at him to get out of his house. And Daniel's totally unfazed and he just wants to sleep in this bed. And so the guy calls the police show up and Daniel's still in bed. And so they haul him out and they arrest him. A year later, Daniel would be arrested again for trespassing, this time in Orlando, Florida at SeaWorld, where Daniel had, after hours, snuck into the manatee exhibit and was swimming around with the manatees because apparently he wanted to play with them. But despite his criminal history, Daniel was far from a hardened criminal. In fact, many people that knew him described him as a very gentle, pot-smoking hippie who just adored animals. In 1999, when Daniel was 27, he joined a small religious community of people that practiced Hare Krishna, which is a branch of Hinduism. They get their name from their chant, Hare Krishna, that devotees repeat over and over and over again. During his stay with this community, Daniel basically blew off all of his responsibilities. He didn't really practice the religion, he didn't help out around the temple. Instead, he spent virtually all of his time feeding the wild birds that came to roost inside of the temple's garden. And he kept this notebook where he diligently tracked who had come into the garden, which bird, and how much he had fed them, and what they looked like. Basically, all he cared about were these birds. After a month of living in the Hare Krishna community, Daniel abruptly tells the other worshippers that he's going to be taking a vow of silence. And this really confused the others because Hare Krishna does not encourage its members to take vows of silence. This was something Daniel was just going to do on his own. And so right before he took his vow of silence, he also informed them that he would be leaving. So he takes his vow of silence, he packs his stuff up, and he leaves. After departing, Daniel committed a series of petty offenses through South Carolina, Washington, Texas, and then ultimately in Florida. One of his offenses in Florida was stealing a candy bar at a 7-Eleven. And in court, because of his vow of silence that he was still living up to, he had to write on a piece of paper that he denied the charge. But ultimately, he was sent to jail for 3 days. After his stint in this Florida jail, Daniel gets out and he decides he wants to go back to Orlando, Florida, and go to the SeaWorld where he had previously jumped into the manatee exhibit. And so he was going to go and presumably check out the manatees as well as some other animals. When he got to the park, he made his way over to the killer whale demonstration where some trainers were going to be swimming around in this enclosure with these massive killer whales. And witnesses said they remember seeing Daniel in the stands watching the show being just totally transfixed and open-mouthed and fascinated with what he was looking at. But apparently Daniel's biggest reaction to any part in the show was when the trainers brought out Tilikum, the biggest killer whale ever held in captivity, measuring over 22 feet long and weighing over 12,000 pounds. Daniel was just totally taken with Tilikum. So that night, after the park shut down and everyone went home, Daniel came back, now wearing a bathing suit. He hops the fence and he sneaks back into SeaWorld the same way he did a couple years earlier when he snuck into the manatee exhibit. And somehow he managed to go through the park without being picked up on a camera. And he makes his way over to the killer whale enclosure. He hops the fence, he takes off his shirt, takes off his shoes. So he's just got his bathing suit on and he jumps into the massive pool with Tilikum. When Daniel jumped into the manatee exhibit, he had said he just wanted to play with the manatees. And so it's assumed that when he jumped in with Tilikum, he just wanted to play with Tilikum. And apparently Tilikum was really eager to play with Daniel, because Tilikum quickly played with Daniel by biting his shorts and bringing him to the bottom of the pool and dragging him along the bottom until Daniel drowned. And then after he drowned, Tilikum basically thrashed him around, throwing him up and down, ripping off pieces of him, until finally he draped Daniel's body over his back, and that's where Tilikum kept him. The next day, when the staff showed up and made this discovery, they couldn't get Daniel's body away from Tilikum because Tilikum wanted to keep his toy. And so they had to use a special medical hoist to lift Tilikum up into the air to recover Daniel's body. Daniel's death was ruled an accident as a result of his poor decision making, and so as such, Tilikum was not punished. In 1910, miners drilling inside of the Nika Cave in Chihuahua, Mexico, punctured through the ground and discovered this flooded cavern. After pumping the water out and stepping inside of this cavern, they were amazed to see these massive gypsum crystals that had formed on the walls and the ceiling all over this cave. Although the crystals were beautiful, they were far less valuable than what these miners were after, which was silver. So instead of trying to, mine out these crystals, they told the locals in the area that they had found this cave and that they really ought to come down here and protect it because it's this amazing natural wonder. And so for the next 100 years, the locals in Chihuahua, Mexico, basically kept this cave that they nicknamed the Cave of Swords under lock and key so that no one would go in there and destroy these amazing crystals. Fast forward to the year 2000 and two men are inside of this mine, not the Nika mine where the Cave of Swords is located, but a mine that was right up against it. And they're drilling down and they're actually at the same level of where the Cave of Swords is located. And they don't know it yet, but they're drilling underneath the Cave of Swords. And they eventually puncture into the rock, revealing this underground flooded cavern. Now, these two men are not tracking that this is right underneath the Cave of Swords. So they're not thinking there could be crystals inside of this flooded cavern. They're thinking there could be silver down there. So after pumping all the water out of this cavern, they crawl down inside and it opens up into this massive cavern with these enormous crystals coming out of the ceiling, the walls, everywhere. And they are like 10 times, 15 times bigger than any of the biggest crystals inside of the Cave of Swords. These are literally the biggest crystals in the world, and this cavern looks like Superman's Fortress of Solitude. It's this unbelievable landscape. This new cave would be dubbed the Giant Crystal Cave, and like its counterpart, the Cave of Swords, it would be handed over to locals to protect. Now, you'd think people would be lining up like crazy to get inside either of these two caves to see these natural wonders. But the truth is, nobody wants to go inside of these caves because they're death traps. Even though both of these caves have had the water drained out of them, their humidity level is still 100%, which means if you're in there too long in either of these two caves, you run the risk of your lungs starting to fill with water, effectively drowning you. In fact, scientists speculate that it would take about 10 minutes for this to happen to you if you were inside one of these caves, assuming you were not wearing a special breathing device that was pumping dry air back into you. But even if you were wearing these special air tanks, the cave would still kill you in about an hour because the temperature exceeds 130 degrees Fahrenheit. And so if you combine the extreme heat with the humidity and the tight enclosed nature of an underground cave, you have a natural oven that if you stay in there too long, it will cook you alive. So the only people that go inside of these caves are researchers that wear all the special equipment, and they only go inside for a couple of minutes at most. But in 2001, so 1 year after the discovery of the Big Crystal Cave, one of the workers who helped drain out the Big Crystal Cave decided, you know what, I want a crystal for myself. And so using his understanding of the mine and his access to this particular section of the mine, he made his way down and got inside of the Big Crystal Cave. Now, the only special equipment he had was a saw, because he figured he could get in there and saw off a piece of one of these crystals and get out of there in just a couple of minutes, certainly well before anything bad would happen to him. So he gets inside, he identifies the crystal he wants, and he starts sawing off the bottom of this crystal. But it dislodges a huge chunk of the crystal that falls on him. Now, when it fell on him, that didn't kill him, but it pinned him inside of this cave. At this point, reality must have sunk in very quickly for this guy. He didn't tell anyone where he was going because what he was doing was illegal, and he knows that nobody checks inside of these caves to see if people are trapped or stuck, because they don't expect people to go into these caves, and they're off limits. A couple of days later, researchers went down into Big Crystal Cave, and they discovered this guy still pinned underneath the big crystal he had cut from the ceiling. It was unclear whether he had died from drowning or from being cooked alive, but either way, he was deceased. To this day, Big Crystal Cave and the Cave of Swords are strictly off limits to the public. On June 30th, 2002, an 18-year-old named Daniel Dick was on vacation with his mother and his 2 younger brothers in Hawaii. Daniel had just graduated from his high school in Los Angeles, where he was the student body president. He was known to invite all of his classmates over to his house all the time for dinners, and girls would call him all the time to try to get advice about their boyfriends. And Daniel also would befriend troubled teens in an attempt to kind of pick them up and get them back on the straight and narrow. When he and his family left for this vacation, he had been working part-time at a grocery store and was getting ready to attend California State University in the fall. That morning, Daniel went down to the beach where he planned on doing some swimming and maybe laying out in the sun for a little bit, and pretty quickly he met 3 girls. And after about 30 minutes of chatting with them, he asked them if they wanted to climb over the fence and check out the blowhole. A blowhole is a fairly narrow hole that is situated on rocks right near where water is crashing. And this hole is usually formed by molten lava that has passed through underneath. And what happens is this hole is connected to a tunnel that feeds down and out into the water. So when the waves come in, they go through this tunnel and they get rocketed up this little opening, causing a massive geyser of water. Now, if you don't go near the blowhole, it's not dangerous at all. It's just a very cool natural phenomenon. The beach that Daniel and these girls were on was situated right near an infamously dangerous blowhole called the Halona blowhole. The reason it was so dangerous is because the water it connected to through that tunnel was some of the most violent in all of Hawaii. So when those waves came barreling through the tunnel, it would shoot 30 plus feet in the air. And so to make sure everybody understood you're only allowed to watch the blowhole from a distance, they actually put up a fence all the way around it and put up signs saying, "Do not go any closer." To give you a sense of how powerful the water was that was churning through this tunnel, if you were standing on the other side of the fence watching the blowhole from a safe distance, you could feel the ground shaking as the waves would rumble through the tunnel and then explode out of the blowhole. According to Daniel's family and friends, he was not a reckless person, he was just a very adventurous person. And so something like this blowhole really piqued his interest, and he just couldn't handle being on the outside of the fence. He really wanted to get right up there and get a look at it. In fact, he told these girls he wanted to feel the power of the water hit him in the chest. That was his plan. The girls told him this was a bad idea, but he was insistent and he began walking over to the rocks where you could climb up and jump this fence. The girls went with him, but they stopped short of the fence. As Daniel made his way over to the rocks, he passed by a couple that was laying on the beach. He waved to them, he climbed up the rocks, he climbed over the fence, and he made his way over to the blowhole. And he timed it to where a wave had just come in and shot a geyser up, and then as soon as the water went down and there was a break, he walked over the edge of this hole that was not very far across, and he kind of arched himself over it so his chest was hovering right over where the water was going to come up. And initially, a wave came through and the water shot up and it hit him in the chest and it kind of staggered him back for a minute. And at this point, the 3 girls and the couple that he had passed are now yelling for him to get away from the blowhole, that it's way too dangerous. But it was too late. He leaned back over the blowhole right as a massive wave came barreling through the tunnel. It rocketed up and it lifted him off the ground about 5 feet in the air, and it turned him upside down so his head is pointed down. And when he fell, he went directly into the blowhole. The couple and the 3 girls that saw this happen described his body position as being the perfect dive. And in order to actually get into the blowhole, you would need the perfect body position, because the opening is very narrow and it goes down 8 feet of just this narrow tube. And at the bottom of that, it opens up like the inside of a teapot. And inside of there is this just vicious churning water that connects to this underground tunnel that feeds out to the sea. And so when Daniel went head first down, his momentum, along with his perfect body position, forced himself down through that hole into that section that's kind of like the inside of a teapot. And once you're inside, there's no way to go back up again. The opening is too tight and there's nothing to hold on to. You wouldn't have the ability to force yourself up through that hole again. So the only way out is through the underground tunnel that leads out to the sea. But there are constantly waves pounding their way up this tunnel into the section where Daniel had fallen into. And so realistically, anybody that tries to swim through this fairly long underground tunnel is only going to get so far before a wave forces them back or traps them in some way in this underground tunnel. As soon as Daniel went into the blowhole, the couple and the 3 girls immediately climbed up the rocks, hopped over the fence, and began looking into the tunnel, yelling for Daniel. And as they're sitting there yelling for him and yelling for people on the beach to call 911, they would feel the ground start to shake as another wave would come through the tunnel and erupt through the blowhole. And they know every time that happened, Daniel, if he was alive, he was completely submerged in water for 30 seconds or so every iteration that this blowhole erupted. By the time the police showed up, Daniel has been trapped inside of this blowhole for some time, and no one's heard him, no one's seen him, and so it's starting to look pretty grim. And the police would say it's nearly impossible for anybody to survive being inside of this blowhole, especially at high tide, which is when he went in. In fact, the police would say, we can't even send divers in there until low tide, because if we send someone in now, they're gonna get killed inside of this blowhole. It's too violent inside of there. And so the best they could do was put a weighted line into the blowhole anchored on the outside, so that if by some miracle Daniel was still alive, he'd be able to grab this line and pull himself up. He probably would not be able to pull himself through the hole to safety, but at least he could keep himself out of the water until rescuers could get there the next day at low tide. But when low tide came the next day and divers went out to the water, they discovered Daniel's body. It was floating near the area where water actually gets sucked into the tunnel and out through the blowhole. During low tide, he must have been pulled back out through the tunnel out to sea. It's unclear how long Daniel was alive once he landed inside of the blowhole, or whether he ever attempted to actually swim through that tunnel out to sea, but at some point he did drown. Daniel's mother petitioned to have a metal grate put over the blowhole so that nobody else would fall in and meet the same fate as her son, but this proposal was met with criticism from the locals, who said the problem was not the blowhole, the problem was people not respecting the power of nature. And so while a fence still surrounds Halona Blowhole, telling people to stay back, the entrance to the blowhole is still uncovered. So that's... On July 11th, 1999, 17-year-old Thomas Nazaro was taking part in a month-long mountaineering course in Alaska. He, along with 10 other students and 3 instructors, had spent the past 26 days hiking up several peaks, and now they were taking a break at the base of this glacier. They were going to hike up the glacier, but before they did, it was customary to reward the students that had done the best job over the previous few weeks, taking on all the different mountaineering skills and survival skills, and allowing those students to hike on their own up this glacier for the last couple of days. And so the instructors hand chose a couple of students that fell into that category. Thomas was one of them, and told them after this break was over, they could head up and they would see them at the end of the trip. And so feeling very proud, Thomas and the other students who had been chosen stood up and began walking up this glacier. And after a couple of hours, they had made it about 3 miles up when they found this perfectly flat area that was perfect for camping out. And so they decided that that would be their campsite for the night. And so everybody started setting up their own tent and getting their sleeping bag laid out, and Thomas volunteered to go find some water. He had heard what sounded like a stream a little ways away from where their campsite was, and so Thomas grabbed his pot and he went around the corner out of sight. After a while, when all the other students had set up their campsites, they realized Thomas had not come back yet, and so they walked around this corner and they looked and they realized it was a dead end. About 100 feet in front of them is just a huge ice wall that goes up on all three sides, and there's nowhere else to go, but Thomas is not up there and he did not come back to the campsite. And so they're thinking, that's pretty weird. I mean, is he behind some ice crevasse that we can't see? And so as they're looking from a distance, they see that his water pot is sitting at the base of this ice cliff. And so they figure, okay, he's somewhere over there, obviously. And so they start walking up towards the base of the ice cliff, still yelling his name, and he's not yelling back. And they get about 3/4 of the way to this ice wall when one of the other students yells, "Stop!" And they all stop and look down where he's looking, and they all realize what's happened to Thomas. They turn around because it's extremely dangerous where they're walking, and they run back through their camp down the trail, and they find their instructors and they tell them what they think happened to Thomas. Their instructors are horrified. They run up the trail. They make it just before the base of this ice wall. They get as close as they can, knowing that it's very dangerous what they're trying to do, and they realize there's nothing they can do to help Thomas. And so before long, the police are called, and it's a full-scale rescue operation on top of this glacier. The theory of what happened to Thomas is he left his campsite with his pot of water. He went around the corner, so he's out of sight, and he went to the stream, the glacier stream, and he started filling up his water, but it was taking a long time because the stream just was not very powerful. And from where he was, he would have heard the sound of rushing water coming from the ice wall because there was water pouring down the ice wall. And so he would have walked over to the base of this ice cliff and put his jug out to get water, and as soon as he was right up against it, he would have slipped down into the ice. Because at the base of this ice wall was something called a moulin, which is a hole in the glacier caused by water runoff percolating down through a crack. And over the years, they can get pretty deep. And so when the police showed up, they went over to the hole and they're yelling down to Thomas, but they're not getting a response. So one of the skinnier officers put on a dry suit and then a harness and then was lowered head first into this hole. And so the inside of a moulin, it starts wide, but then it gets smaller and tighter all the way down until it comes to a point. But sometimes that point is very far down into the ice. And so this officer was hoping that at least, even if he couldn't get to Thomas, he could at least see Thomas. But after going 100 feet down, the hole got so narrow he couldn't go any farther, and even with his light, the hole just kept going. It was like into infinity all the way down into this glacier, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so after that officer was pulled out of the hole, the police went to a fiber optic cable that had a camera at the end of it, and they began lowering that down into this hole. And so down it went, deeper and deeper. It passed the 100-foot mark and all the way down until they literally ran out of cable. And so from this camera's perspective, 250 feet down into this glacier, the hole just kept on going and going and going, and there was no sign of Thomas. And so they pulled the cable out and they realized there was nothing they could do for Thomas. Since he was below 250 feet, that means he fell at least 250 feet. And so it's unlikely he survived the fall to wherever it eventually stopped. And if he did somehow survive the fall, which is a horrifying thought in some ways, he would have been wedged somewhere deep down inside of this glacier, and the water runoff coming off of the ice wall would have eventually filled up all around him and gone over his head, and he would have drowned. And so shortly after the search was started, they called it off. There really was nothing they could do. And unfortunately, his body was never recovered. In 1998, Fresha Bakery, which was a bread company in Leicester, England, was all about profits. And their employees knew this because all the time corners were being cut for the sake of money, even if it was totally dangerous. In May of that year, one of the company's industrial ovens needed a minor repair. One of the cogs inside the oven had come loose and fallen off, and someone just needed to pick it up and put it back on. To picture this oven in your head, think of the scanner you put your luggage through at the airport, the X-ray machine. It's kind of like that. It was this 80-foot long metal tunnel where there was a conveyor belt that ran through it, and you would put dough on one side and it would run through with the conveyor belt through this oven, and then on the other side it would be fully cooked. Whenever repairs were needed inside one of these ovens, the procedure was to completely turn off the oven. So not just the heat, but the whole operation needed to be completely shut down, and then the oven would sit for almost a full 24 hours before a mechanic would go in and make the repair. But the mechanic cost money, and every hour that this bread machine was not operational, the company would lose 15 $1,400. And so the managers of this company thought, you know what, that's too much money to be giving up. If we do the repairs ourselves, that saves us on the cost of the mechanic. And if we can find a way to make the repairs while leaving the oven partially running, that will save us a whole bunch of money too. Someone pointed out that it was possible to turn the heat all the way down in the oven, but allow the conveyor belt to keep rotating through. They just needed to find a way to get in with this conveyor belt moving around them. And so they came up with a plan. Even though the oven sat flush to the ground, there was a side panel that could open up and you could crawl underneath the oven, and right above you would be the conveyor belt. And so they thought, well, hey, if we just remove a couple of sections of the conveyor belt, when that gap in the belt cycles around and is right over someone who is standing underneath it, they can stand up into that gap and kind of be hunched over and walk along inside of the oven, staying in that gap until they come across the cog that's going to be right on the ground. They can pick it up, put it right back on, and keep walking on, staying in the gap until they reach the other side, at which point they could crawl out the exit. The managers were confident, and so they began walking around the factory asking for volunteers, and they were offering extra pay. Two men, 44-year-old Ian Erickson and 47-year-old David Mays, volunteered for the job, and their managers told them they would do it the next day because they needed time to turn the heat off on the oven and let it cool down first. That night, David was out with his friends, and he was talking about how he was kind of nervous about getting inside of a semi-operational industrial oven, but he told them the money was good. The following day at 9 a.m., the oven's heat was turned all the way down, and the plan was it would sit like that all day and cool off all day, and then in the evening, Ian and David would get inside and do the job. But Ian and David had a really important soccer game they wanted to watch that night, and so they asked their manager, would it be possible to go in a little bit earlier? And so the manager walked down to the oven and put his hand inside one of the entrances, and there were fans blowing into it, and it had been off for a couple of hours, and he thought, you know what, this is probably fine, you guys can go now. A few sections of the conveyor belt were removed, Ian was given a radio, and the two men opened the side to the oven, and they crawled in on the far left side of the oven, and they waited for the gap to come around. When it did, they popped up, and they began their journey into the center of the oven. About 5 minutes later, Ian came over the radio and said, hey, it's really hot in here. And the manager came back and said, don't worry, it's supposed to be a little warm in there, but it's nothing that can hurt you. And then a couple of seconds later, Ian comes back over the radio and says, no, it's really hot in here. It is unbearably hot in here. And so one of the managers ran over and checked the temperature gauge, which unbelievably no one had done to that point. And the temperature at the center of the oven was reading over 200 degrees Fahrenheit. It was hot enough to boil water in the center of this oven. And unfortunately, there was nowhere for Ian or David to go. The belt could not go in reverse, and the fastest it could move is 17 minutes start to finish, so agonizingly slow. And they could not crawl up or below the conveyor belt in either direction. There wasn't enough clearance, and they'd get sucked up into the machinery. So they literally had to stay in the gap and slowly walk towards the hottest section of the oven. And so for 10 minutes, Ian and David slowly made their way across this oven, screaming out in pain, yelling for help from anyone, someone, but no one could do anything. And even if they hit the emergency stop button on the oven, it wouldn't help them because the heat inside of the oven is not because it's on, it was residual heat. And by turning off the oven, that would just stop the conveyor belt, trapping Ian and David in the hottest part of the oven. Workers ran and got their tools and did everything they could to try to dismantle portions of the oven to try to get down to Ian and David. But by the time they finally pulled off big pieces of the oven, Ian had already made it to the other side and been pulled out, and he was unfortunately deceased. He had been burned alive, and David had collapsed somewhere in the oven and had been crushed by the machinery that went over him. The bakery and their management team were all fined for their part in this tragedy. Something most people don't know is you can't just put scuba tanks on and then dive down to any depth and come right back up again. The compressed air inside of those scuba tanks would be a mixture of oxygen as well as most likely helium and nitrogen. And when you're breathing that compressed air, the oxygen would get breathed up and then not linger inside of your body. But the other inert gases, the helium and the nitrogen, they would be breathed up and then absorbed into your bloodstream, and they would stay there until you resurfaced. Now, it's completely harmless as long as you understand how it works getting those gases out of your body. In a nutshell, as you ascend, these inert gases will leave your body on their own, but it's a gradual process. If you rocket to the surface before this takes place, these inert gases will not leave your body and they'll expand inside of you, and your body will become the equivalent of a shaken up soda can. And so at best, having all these bubbles inside of you is very painful. At worst, it's lethal. The term for this condition is decompression sickness, but it's better known as the bends. The way divers protect themselves from getting the bends is on their ascent, they do what's called a decompression stop. This is something that is planned into the dive where they stop at a certain depth for a certain amount of time, and that guarantees the inert gases have diffused out of their body before they reach the surface. Now, the deeper you go, the more decompression stops you'll have to do, and the longer they will take. For example, ascending from 2,000 feet would take over 33 hours to do safely. But luckily, none of us are trying to dive down to 2,000 feet. Well, unless you're trying to be an oil and gas saturation diver. Saturation divers, or SAT divers, do construction and demolition at depths of up to 2,000 feet below the surface. But they don't spend 33 hours ascending after every single dive. Instead, after their dives, they're artificially kept at their working depth. The way this works is the SAT diver climbs inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship or on board an oil rig, and this chamber also doubles as their living quarters. There's beds and there's a bathroom, but it's laughably small and uncomfortable. It looks like a small submarine. And once they go inside, they seal the door and then they pressurize it to match the depth that they're going to be working at the bottom of the ocean. And then also there's another pressure chamber called the dive bell that's connected directly onto the side of the chamber. And that's also pressurized to match the working depth. When it was time for the SAT diver to go to work, they would put their dive gear on inside of the chamber. They would crawl directly into the dive bell. They would shut the door behind them and seal it. And then people outside of the dive bell would physically disconnect it from the chamber. And then using a crane, they would place it in the water and then lower it down to their working depth. And once they get down there, because the pressure inside the bell is equal to the pressure outside the bell, they can just slide open a door on the bottom and the water does not come inside. And so the divers do slip through this hole and they do the work they need to do. And when they're done, they come back inside the dive bell, they shut it up, and then using the radio, they communicate with the people up on the boat or up on the rig, and they raise the bell back up, they reattach them to the chamber, they go inside, they take their stuff off, there's bunk beds and there's a bathroom inside of the chamber, and that's where they hang out until their next dive. This process is repeated for days and days and days, keeping them saturated with these gases. And then at the end of their shift, which is usually about a month long, they will have one long decompression they do inside of the chamber. While this system is highly efficient, it does not change the fact that saturation diving is extremely dangerous and terrifying. The sun doesn't reach below 700 feet, so most of the time these divers are in complete and total darkness, and it's unbelievably cold down there. And so their suits have hot water pumped into them through a tether that's connected to the dive bell. But if that were to fail, hypothermia would kick in almost immediately. They have flashlights, but the water is so full of sediment around the areas that they work that shining the light is basically like shining it into fog. You can't really see very far besides right in front of your face. SAT divers also report that sometimes the water around them will suddenly move violently, and they'll look around, but their crummy light and lack of visibility means they can't see what it was, but they know it's a large animal that's checking them out. Other times, these fairly large fish will swim right up to them and come right under their light. It's almost like they're being affectionate with the diver. But they're not being affectionate. They're trying to hide behind the SAT diver from some large predator that's out there watching them. Experienced SAT divers have learned to just accept their harsh environment down there and don't easily get scared. But there is one thing that all SAT divers are afraid of, and that is a lost bell. When SAT divers are down at their working depth, the dive bell that's brought them down there is usually situated right next to them, just kind of floating in the water. And this dive bell is connected to the ship or the oil rig above by a cable. And if that cable were to snap, the dive bell would fall to the bottom and it would take with it the divers because they're always tethered to the dive bell. If the divers survived the crash to the ocean floor, they would then just be trapped and have to hope that someone comes down to get them at some point before they run out of air or they succumb to hypothermia. While a lost bell scenario is incredibly rare, it has happened before. On August 7th, 1979, Richard Walker was inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship in the North Sea. He was a saturation diver who for the past 10 days had been in saturation and honestly was just over it. He wanted to go home to his wife and his 15-month-old daughter. That evening, before his scheduled dive, he wrote in his journal, "Dear God, I just want to get out." Soon after writing this entry, he and his partner, Victor Giel, put on their dive gear and hopped into the dive bell. The bell was detached from the chamber and then brought over to the side of the ship, and right before they lowered it into the water, somebody noticed the location transponder that basically beamed up where it was down below had become loose, and so the decision was made to just remove it. And so after they pulled it off, they lowered the dive bell onto the water and then slowly lowered it down to their working depth, which was 485 feet. Once they got down there, they opened up the hole at the bottom of the bell, and then they began taking turns exiting the bell to go work on this underwater structure. A few hours later, at 2:45 in the morning, Richard was the one outside of the dive bell, and he heard something behind him, and he turned around and he saw the dive bell had slightly tilted on its side. Right as he noticed this, the radio in his helmet kicked on and told him he needed to go back inside the dive bell immediately, and they were going to try to pull them back up. And so Richard went inside the bell, he closed the hole behind him, and then he and Victor listened to the radio as they told them that the main cable holding the dive bell had slipped out. Now, this main cable was not the only thing connecting the dive bell up to the ship. There was also another clump of wires and tubes that was called the umbilical that ran all their power and hot water and their comms down to the dive bell. But this umbilical was not meant to be load-bearing. But as it stood with this main cable gone, the umbilical was holding the dive bell from slipping to the bottom of the ocean. And so the crew up on the ship decided their only choice was to use the umbilical to reel this dive bell back in. And so they began pulling them up by the umbilical, and almost immediately it completely snapped, and the dive bell fell to the bottom of the ocean about 50 feet below. Now, normally a dive bell would have what's called a clump weight hanging off the bottom of it. And in an emergency, you could detach this clump weight, and the dive bell is buoyant enough it would go up to the surface. But Richard and Victor's company had cut corners and not used a clump weight, and instead attached weights directly to the dive bell, which meant when they hit the ocean floor, the actual dive bell was sitting on the ocean floor, where that hole they would normally escape from was pressed into the seabed, so they could not get out of their dive bell. Whereas if there had been a clump weight, the clump weight would have hit the ground and the dive bell would have hovered slightly over it. And so worst case scenario, they could have gotten out and done a wet transfer into another dive bell. So with the umbilical cut, they had no radio communication, they had no heat, they had no light, and they had very little remaining oxygen. And so all they could do was just sit in darkness and hope somebody rescues them. Less than 30 minutes later, another dive ship arrived and offered to help. Now, they were not expecting to dive that night, so it took about 3 hours before they actually had their rescue divers in the water. And unfortunately, because the location transponder had been removed from the dive bell before Richard and Victor went under, it made it almost impossible for these rescue divers to find it. But after an hour of looking around, they finally found it. It was 7 a.m., and they went right down to the porthole and they shined a light inside of the dive bell, and inside Richard and Victor are given a thumbs up like, hey, we're okay, we're just ready to get rescued. The fact that Richard and Victor were okay was communicated back up to the surface, and everybody on top was so excited, so relieved. And in fact, they called Richard's wife and they told her that, hey, there's been an accident, but your husband's just fine, he'll be out very soon. But despite these rescue divers locating the dive bell, because the ship up above that they were attached to kept moving around, it was proving to be extremely difficult for them to stay over the dive bell. And so for the next 2 hours, these rescue divers desperately tried to thread a new wire through the top of the dive bell, but it was going so poorly, and they kept going around and shining their light into the porthole to check on Richard and Victor. And it was very clear that their situation was getting worse and worse by the second. They were not giving thumbs up and smiling. They looked panicked and desperate, and they'd been without heat now for hours, and it was obvious they were running out of oxygen. Finally, at 9 a.m., so 6 hours after Richard and Victor had first hit the sea floor, the rescue divers managed to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell. And before they signaled to have it brought back up again, they shined a light through the porthole to check on them one more time, and they saw that Richard and Victor were just sitting there with their head in their hands. They were clearly still alive and lucid, but it was like they understood they have very little time left, and if this doesn't work, they're doomed. At this point, the rescue divers called up and said it was ready. They got pulled up to the surface, and then the ship began pulling up the dive bell, and almost immediately the cable snapped. And everybody up on the surface knew that at this point, it was almost impossible for them to survive. But nonetheless, rescue divers went down, and it took a while to find the dive bell because it had moved. But when they did, they shined the light through the porthole, and Richard and Victor were still very much alive, but they were not looking to interact with the divers at the window anymore. They were just sitting there looking down. They were despondent. It was like they were making peace with what they understood was going to happen. They were not going to get out of there. And over the course of the next several hours, as these rescue divers tried desperately to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell, they kept checking on Richard and Victor, and each time they checked, they would slouch lower and lower in their seats until both of them were laying on their side. And then finally, the rescue divers got a cable through the top, and then afterwards, they went back up to the ship, and then the ship was able this time to pull the dive bell up and back on board. But when they opened the door, both Richard and Victor had passed away. On February 17th, 2004, shoppers inside of a massive Japanese superstore called Jusco in Wakachi City were suddenly aware of a loud commotion. When they went to investigate, they found a thin young woman with a young baby strapped to her chest, grappling with an older man. Initially, onlookers didn't know what to do. They stood there shocked at what they were seeing. Then the woman yelled out, "Thief!" The man she was fighting with was in his late 60s, and he had pinned the woman and her baby up against this bank of ATMs, and his fists were clenched like he was holding whatever it was he took from her. 3 men from the crowd immediately jumped into action and wrestled the man off of the woman and pinned him to the ground and began trying to pull his hands open to take out whatever he had stolen from this woman, but the man would not unclench his fists. And so these 3 men yelled out to the police that happened to be nearby. They ran over and jumped on top of this guy and handcuffed him, and the man, as he's laying on the ground, is yelling out that he did nothing wrong, and then onlookers would say he began moaning very strangely before he began violently vomiting before falling unconscious. While the police waited for emergency services to show up and take this man to the hospital, they were able to open up his fists and discovered the only thing he was clutching was his own bank card that was now bent in 3 places. The wallet he had on him belonged to him, and the bags that were lying on the ground all around him only contained some pet supplies that he had recently purchased. It did not appear he had actually taken anything from this woman. And speaking of this woman, the police were so caught up in the chaos of the moment that they hadn't even thought to look around for the victim to see if she was okay. So they poke their heads up and start looking around the crowd for this woman, but she's nowhere to be seen. And so they asked the crowd, do we know who she is or where she went? And nobody knew. The police did think it was odd that this woman had walked off without talking to them first, but they figured if she walked away, then everything must be fine. And so they labeled the incident an attempted robbery, and they closed the case. The following day, the older man, who became known as Mr. A by police, died at the hospital as a result of heart failure caused by extreme stress. When the police found out about this, they simply went into the case file, updated it to show the suspect had died, and did not investigate further. But Mr. A's family refused to believe he had just attacked a young woman and her baby. It was completely out of character. He was a gentle retiree who had spent 40 years working for a chemical manufacturer and now was collecting a pension and working part-time as a security guard. He lived with his wife, his children, and his grandchildren, and he lived about a kilometer away from the Jusco, where he had gone that day to get some hamster food for his grandson's hamster. His family pleaded with police to reopen the case and investigate this woman because she must have done something to start this altercation. The police initially resisted, but ultimately conceded and said, okay, we'll check the CCTV camera footage at the Jusco to make sure we didn't miss anything. And what they discovered terrified them. A camera overlooking the ATM bank where this whole scuffle went down picked up this woman about 5 minutes before Mr. A walked into frame. She was standing in a corner just off to the side of the ATMs, and she did appear to have a 2-year-old or 1-year-old strapped to her chest, and she was just standing there motionless with her back to the corner looking down. And then when Mr. A came into frame, he appeared to pull some money out of the ATM. He had bags all over his arms. He turned around after getting his cash and started walking away, and as soon as he does, the woman in the corner suddenly becomes animated. She lifts her head up and walks straight past him, skimming his chest with her hand as she passed. And right after she did that, it was like Mr. A had a reaction to being touched by her, and he instinctively grabbed her arm, and that's when the struggle ensued, and that's when the woman yelled out "thief," although it's clear from the footage that she is the aggressor, not Mr. A. And then at some point, the 3 men jump out of the crowd, they pull him to the ground, the police show up, and then at some point during this chaotic melee, the woman just stands up and meanders her way into the crowd and disappears. Although the police searched every piece of footage in and around this ATM all around the time of the incident, they never found any footage of this woman entering or exiting the Jusco. It was like she just appeared in that corner in order to go after Mr. A and then vanished as soon as it was done. And none of the dozens of witnesses that watched the scuffle take place right in front of them in broad daylight were able to provide any sort of meaningful description of this woman. It was like nobody got a really good look at her. But after reviewing hours and hours of the CCTV footage, the police did find one instance where this woman, for 1 second, looked up at a camera exposing her face. And her face was so unsettling to police that they actually decided not to share the image with the public for an entire year. They were scared that if people saw this image, it would scare them from ever going back to Jusco. This is the image of the woman. As you can see, her face is totally emotionless, her eyes are blank and downcast. Some have compared her face to a death mask, which is a plaster cast of a dead person's face. Other people have said she doesn't even look human. After seeing the CCTV footage, Mr. A's relatives sued the police for detaining him and pinning him to the ground despite his obvious medical distress as a result of whatever this woman did to him. Eventually, they did reach a settlement, but what they really wanted was an explanation for who this woman was. But even after the police released this strange photo to the public, nobody ever came forward, so she was never identified. And it's unlikely she'll ever be identified because the statute of limitations for this case expired in 2011. The case, which is now referred to as the Jusko Phantom, is still very famous in Japan, and it remains a popular topic on long internet chat room threads where people exchange this eerie photograph and speculate about who or what killed Mr. A. In 2010, Sam Ballard was a 19-year-old living in Australia. He was a college student and a standout rugby player. His mother described him as being invincible. One night, Sam and his buddies were over a friend's house having what they called a red wine appreciation night, where they sarcastically pretend to be grown-ups by only drinking wine instead of beer. And after hours of drinking and joking around, they were standing in the backyard on the patio when they noticed a small slug crawling across the ground. And at some point, one of the boys yelled out, "Hey, someone should eat that!" But no one was taking him seriously, and everyone just kind of joked about it. But Sam took it as a challenge and said, "You know what? I'll eat the slug." And everyone's like, "No way, you're not gonna eat that slug." But them telling him he wasn't gonna do it only egged him on, and so he picked that slug up, threw it in his mouth, and he ate it. And the boys howled with laughter. They were so impressed, and for the rest of the night, he was the king. The next morning when Sam got up, he noticed a dull ache in his legs. He attributed the pain to his hangover and expected it to clear by the evening. But by the end of the day, the fog of his hangover had gone away, but the pain in his legs had not. The following day, when he woke up, the pain was not only still there, it had intensified. And so he told his mother about it, and her first concern was that he could be developing multiple sclerosis, something his dad had. Sam was concerned about that too, but he also told her that he had eaten this slug, and he was concerned that, maybe this could be some sort of allergic reaction to that. And his mother said, "You know what, you got nothing to worry about with the slug. Nobody gets sick from things like that." So they went to the doctor, and multiple sclerosis was very quickly ruled out, which was a huge relief to the Ballards. But the doctor said they didn't really have a good reason for why Sam was experiencing this leg pain. Sam brought up the fact that he had eaten this slug, and even though his mom didn't think it was a big deal, he was wondering if maybe this could be an allergic reaction. And the doctor said that off the top of their head, they had no idea if the slug had anything to do with this leg pain. But a couple of days later, the doctor called Sam back and said they had had a chance to do some research, and they spoke to their colleagues, and it looks like Sam had something called rat lungworm disease. This is an infection most commonly found in rats that's caused by a parasitic worm that can be passed down to snails and slugs if they eat the rat feces that contains the parasite's larva. Based on Sam's symptoms, which now included persistent dizziness and vomiting, the doctor informed him that most likely the slug he consumed at that party was a carrier of the parasite. The doctor informed the Ballards that most people who contract rat lungworm disease do so from eating undercooked or raw snails, and they recover without incident once the parasite dies. But in very rare cases, the parasite can penetrate the intestine, traverse the nervous system, and then burrow itself into the outer lining of the brain, causing patients to suffer from a very rare form of meningitis that can be deadly. Sam and his family were told there wasn't much anybody could do to help treat his symptoms, and so all they could really do was just wait to see how severe his case was going to be. And unfortunately, Sam's was extremely severe. Just a few days after his diagnosis, Sam did develop the rare form of meningitis, and he slipped into a coma for 420 days. When he finally woke up, he was paralyzed, he wasn't able to speak, and he couldn't eat without a feeding tube. He required care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But the disease did not affect his mental faculties. He was just as sharp as ever. One of his best friends, Jimmy Galvin, who was there the night Sam ate the slug, said he went into Sam's room after he came out of this coma, and he told Sam how sorry he was that he didn't try to stop him from eating the slug. And although Sam couldn't speak or react in any way, he cried because clearly he had understood what Jimmy had told him. Sam was eventually released from the hospital in a motorized wheelchair 3 years after being admitted. He would only live another 5 years before the infection claimed his life. Sam kept a copy of the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go, close to him over the 8 years following his diagnosis. The book was Dr. Seuss's final salute, offering encouragement to children as they deal with life's inevitable obstacles. Over the years, as he struggled with his severe disabilities, his friends and family would read from this book, willing him to make the best of the challenges he was facing. And then as his friends and family said their final goodbye at his funeral, the book was read one last time. When Conrad Rowland was a little kid, he was always on the go. One time when he was at the grocery store with his mother, he leapt out of the cart and ran away from her, and she found him stuck inside of a freezer. After that incident, she literally made him wear bells on his shoes when they were out in public so she didn't lose track of him. But by the time Conrad was just 4 years old, he had discovered athletics. And instead of putting his energy into running away from his mom, he focused it exclusively on baseball, basketball, soccer, and tennis. And by the time he was 11 years old, he was an exceptional all-around athlete. And at the time, his school announced they were going to have this special guest speaker at an assembly, and it turned out to be the Hall of Fame baseball player Rod Carew. And Conrad was just blown away. He just could not believe he was in the presence of an actual professional athlete, let alone a guy that had achieved the success Rod Carew had. And so after this assembly, when he got home, it was all Conrad could talk about, was just how incredible Mr. Carew was, and how he, Conrad, was gonna be a professional athlete just like Mr. Carew. For many kids, this would just be a phase. They'd be really invested in sports, and then their interest would go somewhere else, and they'd kind of forget about it, and it would not be their life calling anymore. But for Conrad, the impression Rod Carew left on him was so profound that he never wavered. He really did dedicate himself to becoming a professional athlete, and he would be successful. Albeit in a different sport, he became a professional football player in the NFL. And in 2012, Conrad started nearly every game for the New York Jets at tight end. It was like his professional career was going off without a hitch. But in 2013, he injured his knee, which sidelined him for about 2 years. And even though he diligently rehabbed and got back to full strength, the teams were not really ready to take a flyer on him because they were worried his knee would just give out again. He continued to train extremely hard in hopes of landing another contract, but his playing career was starting to look bleak. During the 2016 offseason, Conrad was back home in California visiting his family. One night, as his mother, Mary, was making dinner, Conrad was sitting at the table filling out his driver's license renewal form. And when he got to the section where it asked him if he wanted to be an organ donor, he stopped and he asked his mother, are you an organ donor? And she would say, yeah, I am. And so Conrad said, okay, then I will be too. And he checked the box. And Mary remembers thinking, gosh, I really hope it never comes to that. A few months later, Conrad was working out in a local gym getting ready for the next season when he developed a sudden and severely painful headache. He tried to keep working out, but he just could not do it. So he stepped aside and he called his mom and he told her that he felt this weird click in his head and then he felt this blinding pain behind his left eye. His mother told him he needed to go to the hospital right away. And so that day, Conrad went over to the UCLA Medical Center where they quickly diagnosed him with a brain aneurysm. A brain aneurysm is the bulging or ballooning of a blood vessel in the brain. If the aneurysm bursts, it's fatal about 50% of the time. And for the people who survive a ruptured aneurysm, most likely they will suffer from significant neurological deficits. After his diagnosis, Conrad remained positive and assured his family he was going to kick this thing's butt. But on December 12th, just 4 days after he was admitted, Conrad's aneurysm burst and he never regained consciousness. Because Conrad was an organ donor, the doctors kept his body on life support and they called the recipients at the top of the donor lists. One of them was a man in his 70s who a year earlier had suffered a massive heart attack and desperately needed a new heart. When he and his wife got the call, they were shaking. They couldn't believe it. His life was about to be saved. They already lived right near Los Angeles, so they hopped in their car and they sped to the UCLA Medical Center, and shortly thereafter, news out of the operating room was the transplant had been a success. The man Conrad's heart had just saved was none other than Baseball Hall of Famer Rod Carew, Conrad's childhood hero that had pushed him to become a professional athlete. At first, the families had no idea, but eventually this incredible link was discovered and immediately the two families bonded. Today, because Conrad's family only lives 12 miles away from Rod Carew and his family, Conrad's mother was given a standing invitation by the Carews to stop by anytime she wanted to listen to her son's heart. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. to the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please get a job at the like button's favorite Starbucks just so you can give them a severely burnt coffee every morning. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or